Aspects that journalists and social media commentators should take into account when mentioning and analyzing suicide. By Andrés Núñez Leites. Suicide is a complex and multidimensional phenomenon, which can also be addressed from various disciplines. Beyond the pedantry and professional zeal of some technicians, in reality the complexity of the issue makes it a problem that is difficult to prevent and address institutionally, communally and/or therapeutically. This does not mean that we do not know anything about suicide. Sociology provides statistical guidelines that allow us to illuminate a vulnerable population margins. Anthropology and philosophy can address the meaning of the act from various methodologies, in the same way that psychology can do so from other theoretical frameworks, and biological psychiatry can also establish some common physiological patterns of those prone to suicide, all of which there is abundant bibliography available for the reader. But even so, there is a dimension of suicide that is personal, intimate, individual. Beyond the fact that we conceive of the subject as a subject bound by power relations, or that we can use systemic theoretical models based on biology or psychoanalysis, there is a final instance, within the population most vulnerable to suicide, which is the individual decision. Paradoxically, this individual decision is in itself problematic, because it is legitimately questionable what margins of freedom of thought and degrees of awareness of their actions are held by. For example, people who suffer from severe depression or have experienced a traumatic episode, either recent or distant in time, which they are unable to integrate psychically, typical predictors of suicide attempts. Generally, although suicidal ideation may have been in the mind of someone who attempts and/or succeeds in taking his or her own life for some time, the act of self-elimination occurs in the midst of a specific crisis of psychic imbalance, of an imbalance around a problem from which no way out is perceived. Most people who have survived suicide attempts say that they really wanted to change their life situation, and did not know how. Instead of stopping living, most of them say that they have already felt regret and a desire to live even moments after having triggered the material mechanisms to kill themselves. They must be helped to find ways out. Timely therapeutic intervention can save most people who are approaching this distressing situation. Suicide is also an act of communication, and in this individual decision, with the limitations that we have just outlined, the socially available symbolic means converge to transmit a message. That is to say, someone who takes his own life does not only seek to end his suffering but to say something, and even without wanting to, he says it, because his actions are signs that can be interpreted in his cultural context. This saying something implies some options that can be handled with a greater or lesser degree of awareness. What elements will be used to take his life? What appearance will his body leave? The location where it will be found? The opportunity of the event? The effects on those affected? Who will find him? What emotions will it awaken in him? Etc. Even if we were to raise, as was done in Uruguay for decades, a wall of silence around suicide, these social meanings will be available there, and will be reproduced in everyday stories, in silences, in tears, in the memories of those close to the suicides. Now, just as language is a relatively autonomous system, in the same way as the market, we can say that there is a certain degree of influence of individual, personal decisions, in the way in which certain visions about suicide are promoted by the mass media. That is to say, although they are subject to the logic of the market, which leads them to promote the sale of information commodities that are desirable for viewers consumers, and the current sign that predominates in said merchandise in Uruguay, judging by the most successful programs in terms of rating, is that of the moderate sensationalism, typical of Uruguayan parochialism, promoting a partial, not complex vision of a subject, but pretending equanimity and moderation. It is also true that, without asking for pears from the elm tree, to the extent that promoting a purely technical analysis or without appealing to the emotional could mean a loss of profitability of the information commodity, it is possible that the information is managed from a series of decisions that come from an informed ethical analysis, which take into account, more than anything, the possible effects of contagion, as well as the propagation of potentially suicidal senses. Without trying to identify news and report broadcasting shows and radio, TV and social media channels, neither commentators on social networks, we will say that we have seen, especially on Uruguayan television, programs that, while maximizing the empathy of the public affected and the public suicides, promoted the emotional response of the television audience, with which it was expected that the rating that justifies the commercial support of said shows would be maintained or increased. In general, the following errors are committed in terms of the potential contagion effect. Use of the suicide phenomenon as a big headline capable of attracting an audience. Although it is legitimate for example, a news program to anticipate its content as a form of advertising, sensationalism has a negative effect, to the extent that it generates a perception of an epidemic, or mass phenomenon such as fatality. And although the above has a degree of statistical reality and in terms of public perception of the phenomenon, it would be more convenient if the advancement of the program gave preponderance to therapeutic, institutional and community prevention factors. Idealization of suicide. Those who have taken their own lives tend to appear as morally admirable people who, going through desperate situations, would have had the courage to cross the line of death. What is the message for people who are considering taking their own lives? Suicide leaves an indelible mark and a valuable social image. This does not mean, by any means, that the specific cases of people talked about do not correspond to individuals with a high moral value, but it does offer people who are going through a process of suicidal ideation a very positive hope of building their post-mortem memory, beyond the moral complexity that the biography of each particular individual usually has. Excessive reproduction of the stories of those affected. The immediate family and friends of suicides express their anguish and pain at length. It is an inevitable fact, except in a few cases, suicide leaves an indelible emotional mark, a mark of pain and guilt for not having perceived, in the person who committed suicide, the signs of depression and anxiety in time, or for not having given them what they needed in order to maintain their life meaning, hope and desire to live. Precisely, one of the most recurrent elements in the stories of those who have attempted suicide is the rescue fantasy. At the last moment the saving hand must arrive, which, suddenly becoming aware of the value of the life that is fading away, will then provide the emotional and/or material means so that that life can be carried out in a full or at least more acceptable way. Both this fantasy and the desire to leave a memory of pain and guilt possibly speak of the same need for help on the part of the person who attempts to take his own life. The excessive promotion of the stories of those affected fuels the decision to commit suicide, which, instead of being perceived as a non-solution, to the extent that the cessation of life prevents other paths that include overcoming material and psychological problems, suicide becomes a perceived acceptable solution, either to receive last-minute help or to leave a positive and painful memory at the same time. It must also be taken into account that those affected have, due to the fact of having experienced the suicide of a loved one, a greater possibility of replication than other sectors of the population. A public display of their pain, a recollection of the story of the loss of the life of the loved one, has the potential to cause emotional and psychological imbalance in general for them. Almost obscene display of the methods and places of suicide. For example, close-up shots of the waters of a huge hydroelectric dam capable of swallowing a human being in seconds, should be included in an anthology of what should not be done when reporting on this subject. And something like this was seen in a popular television program in Uruguay a few years ago. On the one hand, it implies, for people with depression and/or suicidal thoughts, the reaffirmation of the convenience or not of using one method or another, in terms of effectiveness, duration of agony, effects on the body, time before the lifeless body will be found, etc., and on the other hand it generates or reaffirms the existence of ideal places for suicide, both in terms of material and symbolic effectiveness. Radio, TV shows and publications on social media also tend to have, mixed with the aforementioned errors, aspects that are favorable to reducing the number of suicides. Trying to interpret the problem psychologically as something that can be addressed therapeutically. Referring to the widespread hypothesis of depression and acute and momentary crises as a psychic environment for suicide, citing specialists in the subject who give a therapeutic vision affirming the possibility of success of psychological and psychiatric treatment. Although depression cannot explain all cases of suicide, there is a high correlation between depression and suicide. This, on the one hand, places suicide as a social problem and codifies it more precisely as a public health problem that both families, communities and institutions must address with some response. Fortunately, it has become common to mention where to seek help in case of depression and/or suicidal ideation. This point should be extended much more, ceasing to be a point. The geometric analogy is valid, with more abundant information and with stories of therapeutic success and community support. This is one of the most important reasons, from the point of view of suicide prevention, to promote public awareness and proactive awareness among the population and institutions. It is necessary to establish detection and prevention networks that involve us all and especially the first line of contact of the persons in crisis: primary care physicians, psychologists and psychiatrists, police, teachers, social workers, among others. Journalists should have more prior information regarding two elements. On the one hand, the contagion potential of their reports on suicide. In this regard, there are several investigations that have managed to prove with a good margin of reliability the existence of this phenomenon, and on the other, the existence of materials available on the Internet for consultation, not only on the phenomenon of suicide, from various disciplines, but specific materials for journalists, on how to report cases. Regarding the TV shows and reports on social networks that repeatedly fall into the errors listed above, we don't doubt the good intentions of the journalists and communicators who carry them out, but it is important that they become aware of the potential of their actions in terms of provoking social contagion and the need to reformulate the journalistic treatment of the subject from more solid ethical and technical bases. Last but not least, I would like to add two perspectives, as a contribution. 1. Sociological. I would like to affirm that it is possible to interpret suicide as a phenomenon that challenges us as a society, to the extent that, together with other morbid elements, traffic accidents, cardiovascular and cerebral accidents, addictions, etc., it can be interpreted as a sign of a post-neoliberal society that, dazzled by the growth of GDP and consumption, permanently generates collateral damage, especially between those who have to bear the most of the din of the game of competition for material and emotional survival, typically the young and the old people, mostly men but also a lot of women. The family, stable couples and marriage as institutions in crisis, the labor market as a space of chronic uncertainty, the meaning of life imploded on daily life and the consumption of goods, designed to generate dissatisfaction and recurrence of consumption, the stress of the acceleration of production and the pressure for productivity, are some of the dimensions that can be seen in the environment of the phenomenon. In Uruguay we have advanced since the 1990s, when I wrote some notes about, specifically, youth suicide and the political and media will to deny or hide suicide, as a sign of the failure of political programs of economic development that ignore its effects on the personal level. Today the subject is talked about. The issue is that this talk about the subject cannot be reduced to a marketing efficiency of the journalistic report, but expanded towards a therapeutic perspective and public health policy. Another view is the religious, spiritual one. My work as a research collaborator with psychiatrists, and my own personal experience regarding the therapeutic potential of the religious, spiritual factor in generating community and psychological support for people with depression and/or suicidal ideation, is evident. In the very secular Uruguay, which still has almost 50% of the population that declares itself Christian, there are no known studies on the subject, but there are in other parts of the world. The correlation, in analysis of dozens of investigations carried out in the United States and Europe, between religiosity, spirituality, overcoming depression and the reduction of suicide attempts based on the ability to accept failures, seeing suffering as an opportunity for spiritual growth, maintaining hope and seeking support, show a positive correlation that is around, coincidentally, 50% when spirituality is taken into account in the psychological and psychiatric therapeutic process. This is because human beings are not only material but spiritual beings, and religiosity is usually a very solid source for the incorporation of a strong, stable sense of life, capable of resisting the storms that, as well as the periods of satisfaction and happiness, life inevitably brings us.